So folks, we're excited to have Father Sam Sawyer with us from Ignite. Father Sawyer is coming live to us from America Media in New York City. Let's give a round of applause for Father Sawyer.
Well, nice to meet all of you. Although, yeah, at the moment I'm sort of looking up at the walls of the room, so I'm going to trust that everybody's there. I heard the applause at least. I'm really grateful to be invited to talk about this, and I think the topic of discernment in an election season. There's actually quite a bit of. There's a few interesting ways to think about, particularly how the principles of Ignatian discernment might apply to the question of an election. So I wanted to start off by doing, I hope, what will be about 10 or 15 minutes of just laying out some framework for talking about Ignatian discernment and applying it to an election, and then open the floor to questions and spend most of our time in conversation back and forth that way. So there's a couple drawings in here. This is actually a drawing of Ignatius as a pilgrim, but this idea that discernment is at least in part a journey. It's not something you're doing once and then finishing. It's something that you're continuing to do throughout your whole life. And Ignatius saw himself and described himself as a pilgrim on this journey throughout his life, even when in the last years of his life he was stationary in Rome running the Jesuits in the early years of the Society of Jesus. Two kinds of discernment we talk about when we talk about discernment in Ignatius's terms. So the first is discernment of spirits, which is in a given situation, figuring out how to pay attention to where God is in this situation, in this set of events. How am I responding, and which spirits? So Ignatius will talk about the good spirit coming from God, the evil spirit, which he calls the enemy of our human nature, but also our own human spirits, which spirits are working, and understanding consolation versus desolation. All that stuff goes into what Ignatius calls discernment of spirits. But this is not actually what we're focusing on today. So the kind of discernment that I think applies more to this question of discernment in an election season is what I would call discernment concerning choices. So Ignatius, in Spiritual Exercises, talks about times for what he calls an election. And yes, I realize that that word is now being used in multiple senses. But what Ignatius is talking about when he talks about election is choices about life, career, ministry, vocation. So the paradigm example of an election often is choosing between a vocation of married life or a vocation of religious life. Or other ways that an election can work for Ignatius are making a choice about a way of proceeding within a vocational choice that's already been made. So how am I going to be a good wife, a good husband, a good priest, etc.? And this kind of discernment concerning choices, is between two or more similarly good options. And because the options are similarly good, Ignatius has the idea that different people could and should make different choices in very similar situations. Because what discernment is looking for here is, what particular choice is God calling me individually to through my relationship with God? Not what is God telling every human being universally to do, but what is God inviting me to cooperate in this particular set of circumstances? That's discernment concerning choices for Ignatius. So that's where I'm going to start in terms of applying this to an election. Oh, by the way, I should flip back and just speak briefly about these pictures. This first one here, that's Ignatius laid up in bed recuperating after being hit by the cannonball. And that's where he begins to learn to pay attention to the movements of God in his heart, which informs his later understanding of discernment of spirits. This is Ignatius towards the end of his life, after he's written the constitutions, the foundational documents of the Jesuit order, and he's offering those constitutions to God. And he spent his whole time writing the constitutions, discerning back and forth about what particular decision should he make for how the Jesuits were going to be governed. And that same document, that same set of documents, with updates made over the years, is still what's governing the Jesuits now, more than 450 years later. Applying this to election in the modern sense, and this picture, this is the ballot box that was used when the Jesuits most recently elected our superior general. So the successor of Ignatius running the Jesuits. And that was the ballot box in the middle of our audience hall where that election was held. When Ignatius talks about an election, he's talking about an individual, personal, significant choice, often about state of life or about how to live one's vocation. We're not talking about an election in that sense, of course. We're talking about a civil election. We're talking about a choice that we make in a democracy, and we will make again 2 years later for some offices, 4 years later for the office of president, etc. But I think there are some things that apply to this because we're still making some pretty fundamental choices about how we as a society are going to order our life together, what kind of society we're going to have, and what goods we're going to pursue through the choices we make. And so in that sense, I think there are lessons from Ignatius's thinking about what election means and how discernment applies to election that can be useful for us in this moment as well. Let me offer a couple outlines about that. First, that we should make a distinction between discerning and deciding. So discernment informs a decision, but the decision itself still needs to be made. And when it comes down to casting a vote in this civil election, there's still going to be a decision that follows whatever you do in discernment. So the kinds of questions that are more amenable to discernment are questions like, what is God's will in this situation? Or if you're asking a how question, how can I love more? How will what I'm doing with my life, or how will the goals we're seeking as a society glorify God? But the deciding questions deal much more with practical realities. So the deciding questions are things like, given the goals that I'm pursuing out of my discernment, what do I actually have to do to put those goals into practice? What specific choices should I make? So in terms of an election, this would be the kind of question about, who am I going to vote for? Am I going to vote for a major party candidate? Is it reasonable maybe to vote for a third party candidate? Might I want to participate in supporting candidates through giving campaign donations, through volunteering to work at the polls or to help get out the vote, etc. Those kinds of very practical decisions will follow on a discernment, but discernment generally is going to be about the larger goals and values we're pursuing, whereas decisions are going to be about how practically do we put those into effect. So some principles for discernment, generally, discernment concerning choices. This kind of discernment requires actual freedom, both moral and practical, which is to say, real discernment is about a choice between two or more goods. So you don't discern, for example, should I steal or should I not steal? Because that's just a choice between good and evil. And there isn't any real discernment there. There might be challenges to work against temptation sometimes, or there might be challenges that the right thing to do is very difficult to do, but it's not one of those moments where we're really seeking the particular will of God in this moment for me, because it's obvious. You should choose the moral good and not choose the moral evil. So discernment looks at a situation where there are two choices, both of which are good, but they're incompatible somehow. You can't just pick both goods together. And again, one of the paradigm examples here is, should I marry this person or another person? You can't marry both of them. Or would I get married or would I go into religious life? Because you can't do both of them at the same time. There are similar sort of less permanent choices about something like, do I take a job in this city or another city? Because I can't take a job in both simultaneously. So those are the kind of choices between two goods where you can't choose both at the same time. Discernment also requires sufficient knowledge, which is different than perfect knowledge, of what the options actually look like, and real time spent in prayer to think about them and to listen to God's response as it's given through the movements of our own hearts. And lastly, this kind of discernment expects rightly ordered desires, which, if you're familiar with Ignatian spirituality, Ignatius discusses in the Principle and Foundation. So what Ignatius is really saying there is, in order to discern well, we have to, at our core, want to serve God with whatever we're doing. So that has to be our core desire, to put ourselves and our talents and our resources at the service of God and at the service of other people. And once we're doing that, then we have the right disposition to discern about more particular circumstances and more particular sets of values that might apply there. And then I'll open it up to questions after this. A couple of ways to talk about how these might apply in an election, in the sense of a civil election. So the first thing I'd say is Ignatius will frame an election as a choice between two goods. But very often, at least in contemporary American politics, we end up talking about what seems to be a choice between the lesser of two evils. And so one thing I think Ignatius can offer us in an election like this is to challenge that framing. Now, certainly there are ways in which we are choosing the lesser of two evils, right? And there are certainly plenty of ways in which both major parties are significantly out of step with what Catholic teaching would propose as a vision of the good, of what is good for human beings and what honors human dignity. But I also think there are significant ways in which the different candidates and the different parties are seeking actual good things as well, right? It is not that we have two people contesting the election who are both equally bent on different evils, and that's all they're trying to do. They're both also trying to do good things. And so I think one of the challenges that thinking about the election in terms of Ignatian discernment offers us is, how can we actually get back in touch with a vote as a choice for something good? Not a completely unfettered choice for good, right? It's a choice for good that also is going to have to put up with some bad things along the way. But how do we actually lift up the goods that we're trying to vote for and not merely tolerate the evils that come along with them? Second point, I would say that the precondition of practical and moral freedom in discernment, that church teaching actually really is helpful here. Because what the church really has to say, when you take a careful look at the teaching about how we vote, is that Catholics in voting need to make a prudential choice about how to best embody Catholic teaching in the complicated field of civil politics, and particularly, in a complicated democracy where you can't choose all good things all at once, where things are more complicated than that. And that choice and the work of putting our values into play in the world really is something that Catholic teaching entrusts to individual conscience, and entrusts particularly as the role of lay people in the church. So priests like me are supposed to help teach what the church has to offer in terms of forming consciences, but we're not supposed to say, vote for this person, don't vote for this person. Instead, we're supposed to say, here are the resources for you to make that decision, but that decision really does lie with individual Catholics and with lay people out in the world putting the gospel into action. And here I would say, particularly because a lot of what goes on in discussion of Catholicism and faith as it applies to the election involves a lot of people saying Catholics must vote this way or can't vote this way. And whenever you hear somebody saying something like that, basically I would say most of those people are lying to you, right? And so Catholic teaching actually really does defend and hold sacrosanct your own duty in conscience to form your conscience and to vote according to it. And so don't let the loudest and least charitable thing you hear pretend to be the authoritative voice of the church on this matter. And I'd point you particularly to paragraphs 31 through 39 of the U.S. Bishop's Faithful Citizenship document, which actually do lay this out very carefully and in a way that really invites careful, conscientious discernment on the part of individual Catholics. And lastly, and then I'll open things up to questions, when you're trying to adopt a discerning spirit for how you're going to look at the election, resist what I call secret decoder ring assumptions. So resist any idea that discernment is a matter of throwing enough data in one end and then turning the crank and getting a single perfect answer out, because that's just not how discernment works. Discernment is not going to yield a universal answer, which applies to every single Catholic in every single circumstance, and nor is it necessarily going to guarantee a correct choice. You know, it is simply the case that faithful Catholics may choose to vote in different ways, will choose to vote in different ways. And it's also the case that, you know, whoever we elect will do some good things and some bad things. We hope more good things than bad things, but there's no guarantee about that either. And discernment is not meant to offer a guarantee about that. Instead, discernment is meant to shape the way we pursue the values that we're trying to put into practice so that we're pursuing them and serving God with as much generosity and as much integrity as we can muster. So I'm going to close this part of the presentation by saying one of the reasons that this secret decoder ring approach will never work is because both elections and discernment are complicated. But the thing we can take hope in is that God is not scared of that complexity. This is the world that God made, and this is the world that God works in. If God wanted to have given us a situation where every single moral question had a bright line answer that was engraved on stone tablets handed down from heaven, moment by moment, God could have done that and didn't. Instead, God gave us this complicated, messy world where we have imperfect elections and imperfect choices between imperfect candidates, and asked us to go and serve our brothers and sisters and to love and glorify God in the middle of this messy world. And as far as I can tell, that is actually what God wants us to be doing. So with that, I'll open up the floor to questions.
Okay, so I'm going to try to give you an angle slowly of, let me see if I turn us the right way. There we go. Just so
I
that
can
you
see a few people
see
now.
the room. And then just sort of, sorry everybody, trying. There we go, cool, okay. And I'm going to plug the sound back in. Cool. All right, so.
Great. So, well, again, Nice to be with you. And yeah, I'm Steve. However
Hey,
questions are
Father.
going to work. Yeah, great. Hi.
Good. So how would we come to vote for the right person or the right issue? Because like as Catholics, I know many people who have voted for numerous different parties. So how can we like find a way to like come together to vote for that right and true choice?
Sure. So, well, the first thing I would say is I wouldn't necessarily expect that Catholics are going to come together in the sense of reaching the same decisions on those things. Different people from different perspectives will prioritize various issues, right? So the U.S. bishops, in their introduction to faithful citizenship, have said that abortion is the preeminent priority for Catholics, and for us as a church. Now, how exactly to apply that? That's much more complicated. One of the reasons it's complicated, of course, is because in different elections, that topic matters in different ways, right? If you're voting, say, for a member of the US House of Representatives, well, that kind of office doesn't actually exercise a lot of authority over the question of something like abortion. Senators and the presidency do, in as much as they affect the Supreme Court, right? But then there are all these prudential and practical questions about, well, what's actually likely to change? You know, do you believe that a given candidate is going to have a significant impact on this? In other circumstances, you could be in a situation, say, where in whatever locality you're voting in, I mean, I vote in New York City, right? Like practically almost every municipal election in New York is decided during the Democratic primary. And so I would only be deceiving myself if I pretended that there were a way to, to cast a significant vote by the time I get to the general election. Anyway, all of that is a big, complicated way to say figuring out the particular circumstances and the likely effect of a vote can impact the way you think about what things should I give priority to at the practical level of voting. What the bishops are offering in faithful citizenship is what issues should we value and prioritize in how we form our political conscience. And so they very clearly say issues of respect for human life and human dignity are crucial. And of those, abortion has the highest priority because it is such a significant assault against the dignity of all human life. But then they go on to say, as Pope Francis has gone on to say, the equally sacred are the lives and the dignity of the poor, and our duty to care for our common home and respect the world that God has given us and care for the environment, to work against the injustice of racism, which is also an assault on human dignity. And in any given circumstance, which is to say either in any given particular election with a particular set of candidates in a particular place, or in a particular time, or based on your own understanding from people you know and the communities you're invested in, one of those may sort of come to the fore. Or you may look at that whole complicated set of issues and say, I think the most significant thing that's likely to happen in the next 2 years or in the next 4 years requires me to pay attention to this. And that, I think, is where discernment really goes to work, right? Because that's where, when we pray, when we're in silence and reflection and listening to God, we feel our hearts being tugged more towards one thing than another. And then we feel the movement of the Spirit sustaining us when we sort of try those different feelings on. And that isn't going to happen the same way for everybody, right? I have people I'm very good friends with who are passionately invested in the pro-life movement and basically have reached in their discernment the conclusion that they're pretty much always going to vote almost exclusively on the abortion issue. I also know people who are passionately involved in movements for racial justice, and that ends up becoming the prime determinant of their vote. And I think both those people are acting, both those sets of people are acting according to their own conscience in a way that they have discerned well about. Most of us are not passionately determined by one single issue like that. Most of us try to work out what mix of issues am I going to pay attention to and try to make the best choice that I can. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, Father. So I
Hi.
know you mentioned earlier, not just we shouldn't just be like okay with kind of the bad sides to each candidate, because I know a lot of people who maybe are voting for Trump and they're like, oh, I don't love everything about him, but I like him more than Biden, so blah blah. Or on the other side, like, oh, I didn't choose Biden, but I'm choosing whatever. How do you suggest people make peace with voting for candidates they don't necessarily fully agree on, and not just merely settling for them?
Right. Well, so I think the first thing I would say is I'm not sure I would counsel making peace, which is to say, I think one of our responsibilities as citizens is to continue to advocate, and maybe even we have a greater responsibility to advocate for those positions on where we disagree with the candidate we're going to vote for. Right? So if you come to a decision in conscience that you should vote for Donald Trump, say because of the abortion issue, as a Catholic, I would argue you have that much more responsibility to advocate forcefully for the dignity of our brothers and sisters at the border, right? If you come into a decision in conscience that you should vote for Biden, I would suggest that you have that much more responsibility to advocate for recognizing the unborn as full members of the human family. So I really do think there's that kind of responsibility to try to push the candidate who you're supporting more in the direction of a fuller embrace of justice across a number of issues. But in terms of coming to peace with it individually, I would say peace with making a particular decision and having to pull a lever or fill in a bubble for one candidate and not another. There I would say your responsibility there is in conscience to have listened to God and to make the best choice possible, right? But first thing, voting is not the most morally significant act you will ever undertake, right? And I think in the range of the things we do as human beings, voting, while it is a very significant moral act, it is completely swamped by the moral significance of who you are as a friend, of who you will be eventually as a spouse or as a parent or in a vocation in religious life or in some form of service. Like all of those are going to be more significant than any one particular vote. And so I think particularly in 2020, American politics has this sort of apocalyptic tone where like the world is always ending tomorrow and we have to figure out how to blow up the asteroid before it hits the planet. And most of the time I think is a kind of it's a form of spiritual desolation to believe that, right? It drags us into despair and it saps our energy to actually do the small good things that really are achievable. And so I guess the way I would say to seek peace in that is, cast your vote according to your conscience as best you can, but then go out and keep doing the actual real world direct contact service and friendship and acts of charity and works of justice that actually are what keep the world moving morally, right? And don't get sucked into this this sense that our politics and our media tend to give us that, the only things that matter happen in Washington, and they're constantly ready to end the world tomorrow.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
I got a question. So you talked about seeking the good. That can seem like a daunting task. I wonder if you had any strategies for that.
Yeah. So I don't know that I have a really concrete strategy for that, but I would say one of the things that I spend a lot of time thinking about, so, by my regular job, my full-time job is as an editor for America Magazine. And so we spend a lot of time we talk about writing at the intersection of the church and the world, and trying to reflect on how the wisdom of the Catholic tradition can be brought to bear and offer something to the contemporary world. And one of the things I think that is core to the Catholic tradition that we struggle to talk about, particularly in the American political context, is the idea of the common good, right? So, which is right at the basics. The common good is at the core of Catholic social teaching, and it has enormous depth in the tradition. And it isn't just, the good for the greatest number, right? Which is a very kind of utilitarian rendition of it. But rather, the common good is the good that we can share together, the good of a community of people. And then the recognition that that community has many different layers, right? All the way from the very immediate layer of like a family unit on up through local and regional and eventually national and eventually global layers. But all of those have their own common goods. And I think that, well, let me give the example this way. One of the things that happens in American political discourse is you don't have to wait too long before two politicians arguing with each other will start to fight over who has the best interests of the American taxpayer at mind, right? And who is better serving what the American taxpayer deserves. And one of the things that a deep formation in Catholic social teaching should suggest to us is that is a bizarre way to talk about how the common good might work, right? As if we buy our way into the common good through paying taxes, which is not to say that it's, certainly we ought to pay taxes, but the people we're actually serving are our fellow citizens and other members of our community. They're not just other taxpayers, right? And what I think that reveals is a kind of very impoverished notion of the common good, that the common good has often been reduced to this sort of transactional, like, what can we buy or what do we have to pay for? And there's a much more expansive notion of the common good from Catholic social teaching. And so I think one of the things we should try to pursue as Catholics in our contributions to American public life is to flesh out that notion of the common good and to try to find ways to talk about it that don't simply get folded down to least common denominator theories of the good.
Thank you.
Oh, those are my knees. Okay. So, I guess my question is, I'm kind of curious, you're a priest and a lot of people see you as like a spiritual, resource, a spiritual guide. What do you say to people who come to you looking for like an endorsement of a particular candidate?
I refuse. No, like what I'll say to people is, and I certainly, if you read what I've written, you can pretty clearly interpret, who I'm critical of and who I'm more willing to support. But I'm not. First off, no Catholic needs my permission or the permission of any other priest to cast a vote, right? And secondly, I'm in no position to give it, right? So one of the things I would do in a situation like that is try to figure out, you know, from whoever's asking me, what are you actually looking for here, right? Do you already know how you want to vote, and you sort of want the church's permission to vote that way? And if so, is it because you, like, are you holding on to some doubt that that vote isn't really moral or isn't really truly in accord with your conscience? And if so, let's talk about what that means and figure out, you know, can I suggest some ways that you can pray with that dilemma and come to a more peaceful, first, a deeper knowledge of what God is saying in conscience, and then secondly, a more peaceful acceptance of it, right? Or other times, you know, I've certainly had people ask questions like that where it turns out on a little bit of discussion and reflection, what people want, like they feel fine about their own vote, and they basically want via some kind of, you know, ruling from the church to say how everybody else has to vote. And then the question is, well, why do you feel the need to determine everyone else's vote? Right? Did God tell you to go determine everyone else's vote? And yeah, so I don't mean to just wave the question off, but I think when people are looking for sort of formal church approval or formal church disapproval of a political decision, there's usually some deeper spiritual need or struggle underneath that. And as a priest, that's actually what I am more interested in than figuring out, you know, how to push the politics in one direction or another.
Cool. All right, thank you.
Father Sawyer, this is Steve. I have a question. Is there an area of American life connected with the common good that we just, as a country, really don't have our eyes on? An area of justice that we collectively, as a country, that we just have blinders on, that you would say, hey, heads up on this?
Well, yeah, a bunch. But let me highlight a couple. So one big one I honestly would say is the question of abortion, which sounds kind of funny to say because it feels like the topic dominates American politics all over the place. But I would say that I think that as a country, we tend to only fight about abortion at the level of how it determines the Supreme Court and presidential politics, which means we are often not talking about the local, more, for lack of a better term, like the mundane issues that are actually in play when people struggle with pregnancies, right? So when a woman becomes pregnant, and when that is a cause for, when that's received as a tragedy rather than as a joy, there are all kinds of things going on there that might have to do with our insufficient support for family leave, with terrible economic circumstances, and not having whole communities where we're not able to provide the kind of jobs that actually allow people to look forward to raising a family. And those kind of questions, I think, have largely dropped. They matter tremendously for the abortion debate, but they almost never get, we almost never reach them because we're always fighting about something else that's usually stuck at the Supreme Court level, where there's relatively little at any given moment that you can do about it. So that's one. Another huge one I would say is what in Pope Francis's terms in Laudato Si, care for our common home, and the issues of climate change. I think we're focused on it again. I would say often in the sort of apocalyptic tones of American politics, but we tend not to think about what are the practical real changes that we can make and would need to make in order to pursue a better approach here. We think about it as kind of this titanic battle between the forces of good and evil, like who accepts science and who denies it, and clearly we should accept science, but the common good actually calls us to a bunch of complicated, more medium-term decisions about how to better care for our common home at one moment, rather than just trying to fix everything with one program there. And then the last thing I would highlight, a very neglected part, I think, of Catholic social teaching is the phrase is the universal destination of goods, which you can find all the way back to the early patristic period and the first couple hundred years of organized theological reflection in the church. And the universal destination of goods is simply the claim that, and Pope Francis highlights this in the recent encyclical Fratelli Tutti as well. The universal destination of goods simply reminds us that before any of us were given anything individually and we possess anything personally as our own property, all of creation was given to human beings as human beings made in the image and likeness of God. And so literally everything belongs to all of us, and created goods have this common universal destination, which is every member of the human family. So this led, some of the church fathers to say things and mean things like, if you have two coats and a poor person has no coat, literally, you are holding on with your second coat, you are holding on to something that belongs to the poor person, and you must give it to that person. I don't think we've come anywhere near grappling with how radical that is. Not in the sense that it means we should go around confiscating private property all over the place, but what it says to us about private property is that private property is a means to an end, right? Private property is useful insofar as it helps us as a human family to achieve the proper distribution of goods. And the proper distribution of goods is everyone being able to have what they need. We're very far from that, and I think there's a lot we need to do to change the way we think, not to get away from private property and treat private property like it's the enemy, but to think about how property rights and how investment and entrepreneurship and all these other things that we're very good at valuing as Americans, how they actually serve the common good of raising the standard of living for the people who have the least.
Wow. Thank you for that mic drop. I know that all three of those, but especially that last one, I'm feeling the burn on that one. Thank you. That was great. So, folks, let's thank Father Sam Sawyer for his time tonight. It's a great presentation. It's an absolute honor and thrill to have you.
Steve, one thing I'm going to do, I pulled together as I was preparing for this. I just have a Google Doc with some links to both America Media's election coverage. We have a podcast we just put out called Voting Catholic that has an episode looking at one episode per issue, looking at a bunch of different issues that are central to Catholic reflection on politics. So I'll pass that Google Doc to you if you can share it with folks.
Absolutely, we'll love to do that.
Yeah, bunch of resources if you feel like going deeper on any of these questions.
That's great. Thanks, Father Sawyer. Oh, this is wonderful. Really appreciate it. And all the best to you and everyone at America House and everyone working for America Media. So
Thanks a lot.
thanks, Father
Really
Sawyer.
nice to meet you all. All right.
Take
Bye.
care.